On a small Mediterranean island called Corsica, in 1769, a boy named Napoleon Bonaparte was born. The island itself was not powerful or rich. It was a place of mountains, sea winds, and simple life. Only a few months before his birth, Corsica had become part of France. Because of this, many people on the island still felt uncertain about their identity and future. Some saw themselves as Corsican first, others as French. Into this world of change, Napoleon was born into a family that was not wealthy, but not completely poor either. Somewhere in the middle, struggling to rise. From the very beginning, Napoleon was not an ordinary child. He was quiet, serious, and often lost in thought. While other children played games outside, he preferred to observe, think, and read when possible. His personality was not loud or friendly in the usual way. Instead, it was focused, intense, and sometimes even distant. His family noticed early that he was different. His father wanted him to succeed in life, especially in the new French system that now controlled Corsica. So when Napoleon was still young, he was sent to mainland France to study at a military school. This moment changed everything in his life. At the military school, Napoleon entered a completely new world. He was far from home, far from his language, and far from the comfort of his island life. Many of the other students came from richer families. They had better clothes, better connections, and more confidence in social situations. Napoleon, on the other hand, felt like an outsider from the first day. One of the biggest challenges for him was language. Although he was learning French, his accent still reflected Corsica. Other students sometimes laughed at him or treated him as inferior. This created a deep feeling of isolation inside him. But instead of breaking him, it made him stronger. Napoleon made a decision very early in his life. If he could not be accepted socially, he would become superior intellectually. He stopped focusing on popularity and began focusing entirely on learning. He spent hours studying mathematics, geography, history, and military science. While others spent time socializing, Napoleon spent time reading and thinking about how battles were won and lost. One of his strongest interests was military strategy. He was especially fascinated by artillery, the use of cannons and battlefield weapons. He began to understand that wars were not only about bravery, but about planning, timing, and positioning. Even as a teenager, he was developing a way of thinking that was more advanced than many adults around him. Despite his intelligence, life at the school was still difficult. He had few friends, and many students did not understand him. He was often alone. But solitude gave him something valuable: focus. He learned to rely on himself rather than others. After years of study, Napoleon graduated and became a young officer in the French army. However, his position was not impressive. He was low-ranking, with limited salary and little influence. His life at this stage was not glamorous. He lived simply, sometimes even struggling financially. There were moments when he felt forgotten by the system he served. At times, he considered returning to Corsica and living a quieter life. But something inside him refused to accept an ordinary future. He believed, deeply and quietly, that he was meant for something greater, even if no one else saw it yet. Then, history began to change around him. In the late 1780s and early 1790s, France entered a period of chaos known as the French Revolution. The country was collapsing under pressure. The monarchy was losing control, the economy was unstable, and people were demanding change. Streets were filled with protests, fear, and political conflict. For many people, this was a time of confusion. But for Napoleon, it was a time of opportunity. Old rules were breaking down. Positions of power were no longer guaranteed by birth or family. Talent and action suddenly mattered more than background. This shift created a space where someone like Napoleon, poor in influence but rich in ambition, could rise. His first real opportunity came in 1793 during a military crisis in the city of Toulon. The city had been taken over by forces opposing the French Revolution, and the French army needed a plan to reclaim it. Many experienced commanders failed to find a solution. Napoleon, still a young officer, studied the situation carefully. Instead of following traditional approaches, he suggested a bold strategy. Use artillery in a concentrated and strategic way to take control of key positions in the city. His plan was risky. It required precision, courage, and timing. But it worked. The French forces succeeded in retaking Toulon, and Napoleon's role in the victory became clear. For the first time, his name began to spread among military leaders. He was no longer invisible. He was becoming known as a young officer with unusual intelligence and confidence. This victory changed his career path. He was promoted quickly, and people began to pay attention to him. But Napoleon did not see Toulon as the end. For him, it was only the beginning of something much larger. Inside his mind, ambition was growing stronger. He began to believe that he could not only win battles, but also influence the direction of an entire nation. While others saw him as a talented officer, Napoleon started seeing himself as someone destined for greatness. At this stage of his life, he was still far from power. He was still unknown to most of Europe, but the foundation had been built. Discipline, intelligence, experience, and ambition. The boy from Corsica had become a soldier of France, and the soldier was about to step into a world where his name would soon be known across an entire continent. But before he could become a ruler, before he could become an emperor, Napoleon would first need to prove himself, again and again, in battles that would shape not only his destiny, but the destiny of Europe itself. After his success at Toulon, Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer an unknown officer. The French military had noticed him, and his name slowly began to circulate among higher ranks. However, France at that time was still in deep chaos because of the revolution. Governments were changing rapidly, alliances were unstable, and the country was surrounded by enemies. In this uncertain environment, talent like Napoleon's became extremely valuable. Still, no one could have predicted how fast he would rise. At just 26 years old, Napoleon was given command of the French army of Italy. This was a major responsibility, and many experienced generals were shocked by the decision. To them, he was too young, too inexperienced, and too different from traditional military leaders. He did not come from nobility, and he did not follow old military traditions blindly. But Napoleon had a different way of thinking. When he arrived in northern Italy in 1796, he found an army in poor condition. Soldiers were tired, poorly fed, and lacking motivation. Supplies were limited, and morale was low. Many commanders would have waited for reinforcements or reorganized slowly. Napoleon did something completely different. He acted immediately. He spoke directly to his soldiers. He did not speak like a distant commander. Instead, he spoke like a leader who understood their struggles. He promised them not only victory, but glory, wealth, and recognition. He told them that they were not just fighting for France, they were shaping history. His words worked. Soldiers began to believe in him. Then, Napoleon launched his campaign in Italy. What followed was a series of fast, aggressive, and intelligent military movements. Instead of engaging in long, drawn-out battles, Napoleon focused on speed and strategy. He separated enemy forces and attacked them one by one before they could unite. This method, known as divide and conquer, became one of his most effective tactics. In a short period of time, Napoleon defeated several Austrian and Allied forces. Cities fell under French control, and his reputation grew rapidly. Newspapers across Europe began writing about him. Some called him a military genius, others called him dangerous. But no one ignored him anymore. What made Napoleon different from other generals was not just his strategy, but his ability to adapt quickly. He understood geography, timing, and psychology of both his enemies and his own soldiers. He was not simply reacting, he was controlling the battlefield. As victories continued, Napoleon became more confident. His army respected him deeply, almost personally. Soldiers felt that he was not distant from them. He often visited camps, spoke directly with troops, and even shared their hardships. This created strong loyalty. After his success in Italy, Napoleon's fame reached France. He was now seen as a national hero. The government, which was still unstable, relied more and more on military leaders like him. But Napoleon was not satisfied with Europe alone. In 1798, he made a bold and surprising decision. He launched an expedition to Egypt. This was not just a military mission, it was also a political and strategic move aimed at weakening Britain's trade routes and expanding French influence into the East. The Egyptian campaign was different from his European battles. At first, Napoleon achieved success. One of his most famous victories was the Battle of the Pyramids, where his forces defeated the Mamluk cavalry. He famously encouraged his soldiers by telling them they were fighting in the shadow of ancient history. However, the situation changed at sea. The British Navy, led by Admiral Horatio Nelson, destroyed the French fleet in the Battle of the Nile. This defeat cut Napoleon off from France. He was now stuck in Egypt with his army, unable to receive reinforcements or return easily. Many leaders in his position might have panicked or surrendered. Napoleon did something unexpected. He adapted again. While in Egypt, he became deeply interested in science, culture, and history. He brought with him scholars and scientists who studied Egyptian monuments, language, and society. This expedition later contributed significantly to the field of Egyptology. Even in a military campaign, Napoleon saw opportunity for knowledge and influence. But despite these intellectual pursuits, he understood something important. His future was not in Egypt. Back in France, political conditions were deteriorating. The government, known as the Directory, was weak and unpopular. Corruption was widespread, and the country was losing stability. People were tired of chaos and wanted strong leadership. Napoleon saw his moment. In 1799, he left Egypt secretly and returned to France. His return was carefully planned and politically timed. When he arrived, he was welcomed as a hero by many citizens who saw him as a symbol of hope and strength. France was ready for change. With support from allies in politics and the military, Napoleon organized a coup d'état in November 1799, known as the Coup of 18 Brumaire. The existing government was removed, and a new political system was established. Napoleon became one of the 3 consuls of France. However, in reality, he held the most power. This was the beginning of his true political dominance. Soon, he became first consul. which gave him control over the military, government administration, and major national decisions. He was no longer just a general. He was now the central figure of French power. During this time, Napoleon introduced major reforms. He improved the legal system by creating the Napoleonic Code, which brought structure and consistency to French law. He reformed education, stabilized the economy, and restored order in a country that had been chaotic for years. Many people saw him as a savior of France. But beneath all of this success, something deeper was changing inside Napoleon. He was no longer thinking like a military officer serving a nation. He was beginning to think like a ruler, shaping a nation according to his vision. His confidence grew into ambition, and his ambition slowly turned into belief in destiny. He believed that France needed strong leadership, and that he was the only one capable of providing it. By 1804, Napoleon was ready to take the final step that would transform him from a powerful leader into something even greater. He was about to become emperor, and Europe would never be the same again. By the early 1800s, Napoleon Bonaparte had already done what many leaders could only dream of. He had risen from a poor Corsican background to become the most powerful man in France. He had survived political chaos, military challenges, and international wars. But Napoleon was not someone who was satisfied with enough. His ambition always pushed him further. In 1804, he made a decision that would shock both France and the rest of Europe. He decided to become emperor. On December 2nd, 1804, in the Grand Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, a historic ceremony took place. Kings, nobles, military officers, and religious leaders gathered to witness the moment. The Pope himself was present, as tradition required the Pope to crown the emperor. But Napoleon changed tradition. In front of everyone, he took the crown into his own hands and placed it on his head. That moment sent a powerful message. His authority did not come from the church or old traditions. It came from himself. From that day, he was no longer first consul. He was Napoleon I, Emperor of the French. This was the peak of his rise. As emperor, Napoleon began reorganizing France with incredible speed. He strengthened the government, improved tax systems, expanded education, and centralized power. One of his most important achievements was the Napoleonic Code, a legal system that replaced old laws with clear and organized rules. This code influenced many countries around the world and is still studied today. Inside France, many people admired him. After years of revolution and instability, Napoleon brought order. Roads improved, administration became more efficient, and national pride grew. But Napoleon's vision was never limited to France. He wanted to control Europe. Between 1805 and 1807, Napoleon achieved some of his greatest military victories. He defeated Austria, Prussia, and Russia in a series of brilliant campaigns. One of his most famous victories was the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805. There he faced the combined forces of Austria and Russia. Through careful planning and deception, he achieved a decisive victory. It is still considered one of the greatest tactical battles in military history. At this point, Napoleon's empire stretched across much of Europe. He placed his family members and loyal generals on thrones in various regions. To many European leaders, it seemed like Napoleon could not be stopped. However, power always creates resistance. Great Britain remained his strongest enemy. Unlike other countries, Britain could not be easily defeated on land because of its powerful navy. Napoleon tried to weaken Britain economically through the continental system, which aimed to block trade with British goods across Europe. But this plan created problems. Many countries secretly ignored the system because they depended on trade. Still, Napoleon believed his system would eventually work. Then came the turning point that changed everything. In 1812, Napoleon made one of the most dangerous decisions of his life. He invaded Russia. At first, everything looked powerful and confident. His army, known as the Grande Armée, was massive, over 600,000 soldiers from different parts of Europe. It was one of the largest military forces ever assembled at that time. Napoleon believed Russia would surrender quickly, but he underestimated his enemy. Instead of fighting large battles, Russian forces began retreating deeper into their territory. As they withdrew, they burned crops, villages, and supplies behind them. This strategy is known as scorched earth. It left Napoleon's army without food, shelter, or resources. As the army moved further into Russia, the situation became worse. Then came winter. The Russian winter was brutal. Temperatures dropped extremely low. Soldiers who were not prepared for such conditions began to suffer from hunger, frostbite, and exhaustion. Horses died, supplies ran out, discipline began to break. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow, the city was nearly empty and partially burned. He waited for a Russian surrender, but it never came. Eventually, he had no choice but to retreat. The retreat from Russia became one of the greatest disasters in military history. The once great Grande Armée was destroyed not in a single battle, but by distance, cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Thousands of soldiers died on the way back. Only a small fraction survived. For the first time, Napoleon was truly weakened. His enemies saw this moment clearly. European nations formed a new coalition against him. Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain joined forces. Step by step, they pushed his armies back. In 1814, Paris was captured. Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne. He was sent into exile on the island of Elba. For a moment, it seemed like his story had ended. But Napoleon was not the kind of man who accepted defeat easily. In 1815, he escaped from Elba and returned to France. His return was dramatic. Soldiers sent to stop him instead joined him. Crowds welcomed him. The king who had replaced him fled. Napoleon regained power in what is known as the 100 Days. But Europe had already learned its lesson. A final coalition was formed immediately to stop him once and for all. This led to the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. It was a short but decisive battle. Napoleon faced British forces led by the Duke of Wellington and Prussian forces led by Field Marshal Blücher. The battle was intense, but Napoleon's army was finally defeated. This defeat marked the end of his power. He was exiled again, this time far away on the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean. Unlike Elba, there was no escape from this place. There, Napoleon spent his final years in isolation. No armies, no politics, no empire, only memories. He reflected on his victories, his mistakes, and the life he had lived at extreme speed and intensity. The man who once controlled most of Europe died in 1821. Napoleon's life is a powerful story of ambition, intelligence, and determination. He rose from a small island to become emperor of a continent. But it is also a story of how unstoppable ambition, when pushed too far, can lead to downfall. He changed history forever, but in the end, history also caught up with him.